Hey guys, welcome back. So now, before we get into Joker War, I want to take a short while and talk about not only some of the things that led up to this event, but also a few which that have been boiling up under the surface, as well as why the Joker decided to do this now. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch your spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so to start a bit of this off, we gotta talk a bit about what Batman's been going through up to this point. Because on this channel, a lot of what we've been talking about with Batman so far, it's been a lot of where is Batman and who is Batman, but I've never really taken the time to talk about how is Batman. Because for a little while now, he hasn't been doing too good. Because not long ago, he was nearly married to Selina Kyle, which was his near opportunity at living a normal life, with the two of them stepping away from who they formerly were, and taking a stab at a more domesticated future together. But of course, that at the time it didn't happen, because she left him at the altar, and mainly because she was led to believe that marrying Bruce would not only make him happy, but doing that would also kill the Batman, who's the person that's needed to save everyone. And with her more or less turning her leaf as a hero, she let him know that heroes make sacrifices, and in her case, her sacrifice was not marrying Bruce. And this is something you can look at a couple of ways, because one, she did leave him at the altar, but ultimately after that, they did continue to work together, which also showed us with time that they were still sustaining some form of their relationship. But even with that being the case, during this time, we saw a point where Bruce was vulnerable, where he expressed that a part of him was ready for love and ready for a life where he didn't have to be Batman, which he would have done had Selina showed up, but when she didn't, he immediately went back to being Batman, which on the other hand is also what he wanted, but we'll get more into that later on. And so then after this, you then got City of Bane, which came in right after and just tore a bigger hole in Batman's heart. Because for one, facing Bane at any point in time, it takes a lot out of the Caped Crusader, to say the least. And this is one of those things at the time that nearly pushed Batman to killing Bane, which I feel like he would have done had he known at the time when he taken Bane down, that one, Bane's plans were being manipulated and coerced by Thomas Wayne, but also prior to Bane being defeated, he had also killed Alfred, which is something that Bruce hadn't discovered till after taking Bane down. But I bring all of this up not only as a reminder to kind of emphasize where Bruce is, because even after all this, when he just continues to go on to be Batman, there's a lot of baggage from these events that he's still holding on to. And even back at that moment when Alfred died and we seen Bruce lash out, which for one is a super rare Batman moment, but even with us seeing that moment in its rarity, I still stand on to this day that Batman is one of the most emotional heroes like ever, even though he usually doesn't show it. But because he doesn't usually show it doesn't mean he doesn't feel anything. And in City of Bane, when he had lost Alfred, all those emotions came crashing through. But just before we wrap up on City of Bane, because that's pretty much where Joker War started, and I'll get to more about that in just a little bit. But just for a moment before I get into that, just to stay on the topic of how Bruce Wayne handles emotions and how deeply he cares, though he doesn't express it in the most conventional of ways most of the time. Because most of the time we just see him as Batman, he grunts, he breaks bones, and he makes people swear to him. But with knowing this, always keep in mind that the Batman which Bruce Wayne had became, this transformation was birthed from the loss of his parents, which then led Bruce Wayne to become what he believed that he needed to, so that tragedies like that would not happen again. And with becoming Batman and using extreme efforts, just shy of actually killing criminals, how much he cares and how much he's still hurt, it all comes through with the efforts that we see him put into being Batman. From his training to his gadgets to his preparations, for years these have all been like the sustained reactions from that child who's lost his parents, who still cares as if it had happened yesterday. Which is also something that Selina had specifically mentioned when Selina left him at the altar and told him that he was a hurt child, who had then found a way to turn his hurt into hope. And for the longest time, being the Batman was Bruce's best way of expressing all of this because it was the best solution that he had come to. But then after the death of Alfred, he had then began to second guess that more than ever. And for some time after, we would then see a collection of Bruce's thoughts over the years to where he would then try to put some of his own ideas plus the wishes of Alfred and then scope them into some idea of how he could do all of this better. But until he figures that out, he has to keep being Batman. Because it's not like you can just tell all the villains time out so that he can take a bat break and just figure out how to do things the right way. No, it's like he's working on it, but in the meantime, he still has to be Batman. But from here, I want to go into an epilogue that we had got at the conclusion of City of Bane, because it's here where we picked up with a couple of the Joker's thugs who had just found out, like on the Shade Room or something, that Clark Kent had revealed his identity to the world as Superman. And so this thug then tells the Joker, like, you know, rumor has it that you know who Batman really is. So then why not use that information against Batman while it's still worth something? And so now before the Joker bashed his head into the table about a dozen times, he let him know that using the information that he knows about Batman's true identity is like a punchline. And once you use it, you can't put the boom back in the dynamite, you can't put the whoopee back in the cushion. Like once it's done, it's done. And when it is done, it would be something that only one of them could walk away from. And after saying it out loud, the Joker was then like, well, you know what? I think this is the perfect time for that. And it was from this point forward where we knew the Joker was working on something huge that would be aimed at Bruce Wayne and Batman both in one swing. But after this, it would be quite some time before we got a hint of what that would be. And so now after this, we then jump back over to Batman, to who with everything that he's recently been through, he's continuing to be Batman. Because once again, that's his solution until a better one resolves. But it's in this moment where Bruce thinks back to some old sketches of Gotham, which he would either sketch on napkins or in the back of old case books, and the plans for those sketches we'll get to in a little bit. But in this moment where Bruce is thinking back on them, he's also thinking about Alfred, and how Alfred perceived Bruce's designs as designs for a better Gotham, and a Gotham that didn't need Batman. Because for Alfred, he would always want Bruce to take these ideas and form them into some type of structure or plan to where the city wouldn't just fall apart if Bruce had stopped being Batman. And when we jump in here, we see that Bruce has already started fulfilling Alfred's vision, and he spared no expense to fast track it by sending generous donations to re-election boards in order to get the right people to move quicker to make this happen. And even though Selina jokes about this a little bit at one of the fundraisers, which is currently taking place, I'm pretty sure this is one of those joking, not joking situations. But in the case of Bruce, the reason why he's out and occupied, it's mainly because 5 assassins have recently returned to Gotham all at the same time. And of these assassins, you had Cheshire, Merlin, Gunsmith, Mr. Teeth, and Deathstroke. And initially when they showed up with their specific targets, Bruce had no idea who had hired them or why they were sent after who they were sent after, which essentially is just the tip of the iceberg here. But at least this portion Batman then began to figure out, which is something we get a lot more detail with throughout the course of Batman Secret Files issue 3. Because it's here where we get a bit of the story in between Batman issue 86 to 89, which I want to say like even still took place within the course of 24 hours. But it was through the course of Secret Files where we had seen Batman track the arrival of the assassins to where he discovered that they were being led by Deathstroke, but even still he didn't know who hired them. But it's through the course of Secret Files where Batman discovers the assassins who he's up against, and with doing so he uses that information to get Lucius Fox to build him a specific type of vehicle designed specifically to take all of them down, which we then later see in Batman issue 86. And this moment is very important because it is a bit of a flex, but it also shows us that in sub-level 13 below Wayne Enterprises, that whatever crazy vehicle that Batman can think of, that he has the means to print it out within 24 hours. So imagine that in the wrong hands. But essentially with Bruce using this new vehicle called the Night Climber, he uses it to capture Deathstroke first, being that he's the most dangerous out of the group. He thinks the fastest and he's the most likely to adapt and evade it than anyone else who's there. So rather than just trying to catch everybody at one time, he specifically goes for Deathstroke, while all the others are chased off by this marble that gives out the projection that leads them each to believe that he's gone after them individually, which in this case buys Bruce more time to spend more focus on Deathstroke, and then from there later pursue the others in order from most difficult to least difficult. But even with doing this and eventually capturing Deathstroke, there's a bit of a spoiler conversation with a bit of what Deathstroke had told Batman just before being taken down here, and we'll revisit some of that at the latter end of this video, because had Batman been paying a little bit more attention in this moment, things could have played out a little bit different. But in this moment we also see that Bruce is a bit off, because when he opens the comms he calls for Alfred, but of course at this time we know that Alfred is no longer with us. But in this moment of fatigue his name slips out, because one, he's used to having Alfred in that chair on the other end, but also since Alfred's passed, Bruce can't help but think of him as he looks over Gotham and he sees what Alfred had hoped that Bruce's plans would one day become. But from there Bruce then goes on to chase the others to where he rounds them up and drops them off with Commissioner Bullock. But after this we then go to Selina Kyle back at the fundraiser to where she had caught a suspicious looking gentleman sneaking into the Tri-Corner yards, to where when she catches him, dude just melts down like he's made of pop rocks. And when this happens and a voice speaks through him, it's here where Selina recognizes that it's the return of the designer. And initially when she discovers this, she doesn't tell Bruce the whole thing. She just tells him like, like, well, this dude was down here trying to replace the blueprints for his new Gotham plan, and she keeps it at that. But because the designer is supposed to have been dead, she then goes to dig up his grave, like immediately after talking to Bruce, while also simultaneously calling the Riddler to confirm that the designer is actually dead. And it's really their history with the designer which ties together the arrival of all the assassins, and the little sneaky dude trying to switch out Batman's blueprints, and even his zombified appearance just before his body combusted into bubbles in green seltzer. And so just to brush up on a bit of history with the designer, and just how Selina, the Riddler, the Joker, and the Penguin all came to know him, a number of years back he invited them all out to his Tartarus house, being that they were all Gotham's finest villains, and it's here where they had first seen that the whole zombie minion thing, that it was what he was into. But with him inviting them all there, his motive was to give each of them, individually, the perfect design to pursue whatever it was that they were truly after, which for everyone in this group was something completely different. And the reason that he was so esteemed to this position to where he could give this advice and essentially teach them on how to stop failing, it was mainly because many years ago he had failed numerous times to the world's greatest detective, all until he fell back, took a year off, and once again, villains can do that, heroes can't. We talked about that earlier. But with taking a year off, he devised the perfect plan, which then humiliated that detective and sent him into retirement. And ever since then, the designer has gained this reputation of not just being the best who ever done it, but also being the one that nobody knows about because he got away with it all without a trace. But around this time, he had taken each of them into his office one by one, asked them what they wanted, and after that, he would draw the designs of how they would get it done. And in return for his payment, he would then take half of whatever their payout was. And at the time, amongst their plans, the Penguin wanted to be mayor, the Riddler, he wanted to turn the city into a technological labyrinth, and Selina wanted to rob the richest man in Gotham, who of course was none other than Bruce Wayne. And all of their plans were so elaborate, like they were super excited like it had already happened. But in the case of the Joker, who had no bottom to the depths that he would sink to, unlike the others, he was in the office with the designer for hours. And the next thing that Selina recalled was him coming out of that office and telling his zombies to kill everybody. But the Joker came out right after him and ended that man's whole career with a pistol that he had tucked away. But this was Selina's last memory of the designer. He was a guy with these brilliant plans, and then the Joker just blew his brains out. But after that had happened and the Riddler and the Penguin had burned the Tartarus house down, she'll never forget that that night the Joker was just staring at Gotham City the whole time with a look in his eyes that she had never seen before. But going back to Selina, who's digging up the body of where they had buried the designer, she gets to the bottom, she opens the casket, and it appears to be the Joker. And initially she did believe that it was, but she found out soon after that it wasn't when she was attacked by more green mist zombies, and the corpse started speaking to her with the voice of the designer, but even more so in this moment when she was met by the arrival of Harley Quinn, who had not only made it here just in time to help Selina out, but she also quickly let Selina know that she had made her way here back to Gotham following a trail of bodies of a number of people who formerly worked for the Joker, including poor Artie, who was laying in that casket. And with Harley saying this is a reference to the epilogues that we got prior to this point, to where with everyone who was helping the Joker with whatever he was working on next, he had then ordered the next team to kill the previous team after each job was done. And he did this just so that anyone who had helped him with what he was working on, who had known only pieces of his plan, that they would just be out of the picture, which would then assure him that no one would spoil the punchline of his next joke. But also at the graveyard, you then have Merlin and Cheshire who show up and attack Harley and Selina, but when this happens, we then find out that Punchline has been here watching the whole time. And with doing so, she's also sizing up Harley Quinn a bit, also saying that she doesn't look that tough, but we'll also get into more of that in a little bit, because Punchline's hatred for Harley is pretty deep, even though she don't know her like that. But when she sees them there and she reaches out to the Joker, she lets him know that they've seen the body, but Batman's attention is elsewhere. And it's here where he lets her know that that's fine because there's a few other people that he needs to talk to before the quote big game starts. And of those people are Rick Grayson, Jason Todd, Timothy Drake, Damian Wayne, and Barbara Gordon, which gives us a bit of foreshadowing of what the Joker has in store for the Bat family, which is one of those things where I just gotta say right here, like, man, Rick Grayson just can't get a break. And I'ma just leave it right there because I don't want to get too ahead of myself before the end of this video, because when we get back to Nightwing, I may need to vent for a little bit, so I'll just save those thoughts for another time. But when Selina and Harley catch up to Batman, after handling Merlin and Cheshire of course, but it's here where Selina finally approaches her moment of truth, and with doing so, telling Bruce about the designer and the deal that her and the other villains had had with the designer many years ago, to where for the Penguin it included a number of assassins coming to town, killing specific targets in order to give him a seat as Gotham's new mayor, which for one, that's something that Bruce already seen firsthand get started and put into play. And then on top of that, you have the Riddler and his request for Gotham to become a labyrinth of riddles, which then explains why Bruce had just seen a designer speaking with the Riddler, which then only leaves Selina Kyle and her request, and at that point Bruce didn't even need to hear the rest of it. He was like, oh man, he gonna rob me next. And mainly because Bruce knew who Selina was at that time, and the kind of request that she would have made being in that position. But from here they go their separate ways, and Batman runs into Deathstroke once again, and mainly because the assassins who were caught at first, a number of them were body doubles, which had then set Batman on another chase, leaving the real Deathstroke behind, to where when he came across the Penguin, who tried to make a move because the whole assassin thing was his plan, so he tried to be a step ahead, but it really only led to Deathstroke cutting his throat so that he can get away. Because in that instance, Batman had to take the Penguin to the hospital, or else he just would have bled out. But since then, Deathstroke's been on the loose and he's back again. But it's here where he also gets an announcement from the designer, and really all of Gotham gets this announcement. But it's here where the designer ends Deathstroke's contract and starts the Riddler's game of turning the whole city into a labyrinth, much like how the Riddler wanted his perfect design to play out. But also during this time you have Selina and Harley, who make their way to go see the Underbroker, because at this point Selina has the plan of stealing Bruce's money before the designer can, in order to keep it out of his reach. But when Selina and Harley make their way here to see the Underbroker, it's here where they're also met by the arrival of Punchline. And so now here's the thing with Punchline, because we haven't talked Punchline since like her full first appearance in Hell Arisen. Because back when we talked about her in Hell Arisen, she very much came off as like a partner of the Joker. But when we jump forward to Batman issues 89 and 92, it's here where we begin to see that it's a lot deeper than that. And we initially see that when she expresses how she's disgusted at Harley Quinn, and mainly because she feels like when Harley was with the Joker, she was keeping him from being his true self, or even the absolute version of himself, almost as if Harley wanted to fix the Joker, which could be to credit because of Harley's psychiatric background, which may have been a thing to where Harley continually felt like the Joker was her patient. Who knows? While on the flip side, Punchline, who's way more serious, and in her case she idolizes the Joker's cause, and is borderline crazy to the extent where she probably even die for it. Like, it's deep. But even also in addition to that, we see a number of occasions where she craves the Joker's approval. So even though we're constantly given the idea that their relationship is strictly professional, which I'm pretty sure for the most part it is, but in the case of Punchline, there's a bit of this obsession that makes you question, like, what's at the root of those moments, with her truly despising Harley Quinn, or her being super offended when somebody speaks of the Joker a certain way. Like, it's a bit more over the top than what you would expect from just a partner. But at this point, jumping back over to Batman and Deathstroke, to where at this point Deathstroke's kind of tagging along since he was laid off by the designer. But not long after, Batman makes his way through the Riddler's labyrinth to where he finds him hiding out in his office in Wayne Enterprises. And when they get there, Batman hits Deathstroke with the elephant tranquilizer because he don't want him sneaking up on him and doing nothing crazy. And in the case of the Riddler, he just gave him a baby dose of Z-Quil, which put him right to sleep. But it's also here in his office where he's met by the designer, who's just sitting there waiting for him. But after a quick duel with the designer, it's here where Bruce quickly finds out that this wasn't the designer this whole time, but rather just a zombified corpse of the actual designer who the Joker had killed many years ago. And the Joker had been using him like a puppet this entire time, orchestrating all of these moves as if he were the designer, because once again the Joker was there when the designer spelled out all these plans for all the different villains years ago. And immediately when Batman finds this out, the Joker activates his contract with Deathstroke, to where then Deathstroke stabs Bruce in the leg. But we're gonna put a pin in that for just a moment, no pun intended. But it's here where I want to go back to Batman's Secret Files and take a deeper look into this story, because it was in that first matchup we had seen between Deathstroke and Batman to where Deathstroke almost gave away some critical information. Because at the time he had told Batman, like, you think this is over, that's a funny joke, and you have no idea why, but you will. And like when Deathstroke said that, it's like he's that guy who'd see the movie and then call you right after and don't even say hello. He'll just be like, Iron Man dies, first thing come out of his mouth, and like just give you no chance to avoid the spoiler. But either way, it's here where we find out that a month prior to all this going down, the Joker had actually approached Deathstroke, and initially Slade had thought it was some kind of setup for a sick joke. But instead the Joker was kind of like, you know what, this is actually a good one, you're gonna want to hear this. And when the Joker tells Slade the plan, of which he knew he just couldn't resist after hearing it, but when he tells it to him, Deathstroke is like legit shocked. And of course the Joker, he's not surprised at Slade's reaction, because most people, they just believe that the Joker is too crazy to be as smart as he actually is. But with telling Deathstroke what the plan entails and what he would need from him, he then offers Deathstroke as a payday the would-be inheritance of Rick Grayson, which is 1/5 of Bruce Wayne's account, which roughly equates to $20 billion. And at that point, Deathstroke's like, what, you want me to play a part? I'll be Daniel Day-Lewis in this thing. Like, what you need me to do? What do you want me to do? You want me to stand over here? Okay. But no, really, at this point, Deathstroke, he just wanted proof from the Joker that he had the means to get this done. And from there, he wanted a closer look at the step-by-step execution, just to be assured that there wasn't any holes in the plan. But at this point, the Joker had that covered and some, and from that moment he already knew that Slade was in. But in the end of this phase of the Joker's plan, when Selina Kyle had attempted to transfer the money of Bruce Wayne in order to protect it, but instead she had been set up, and she ended up giving all the account numbers and the routing information over to Punchline, to where shortly after, Punchline shot Selina when it was done. And it's here where she called the Joker and he was like straight up like, I want to hear the words. Like when that deposit hit, you want to hear the words. And it's here where she told the Joker that he is now worth over $100 billion. And he immediately acts like any normal human being who would have heard the same. You can't tell me no different. But jumping back over to Bruce, who's been waiting this whole time with the sword in his leg. But with the way that Deathstroke has set it in there, Bruce literally could hardly move, let alone remove it, or he would just bleed out and die in a matter of minutes, which left him stuck there waiting for Lucius to tend to it, but also allowing Deathstroke to get away. But along with the Joker's play, he already had news and media set up like as soon as the deposit hit, so that they would run these stories about Bruce Wayne embezzling millions, like the whole narrative was set up and ready to go. And when Lucius tells Bruce about Selina, Bruce is like, just get her on the phone now. So Lucius calls his daughter so she can put the phone to Selina's ear. And it's crazy when they hear each other because immediately they're both apologizing. And on one hand, Selina's like, I messed up, I let this happen. But then Bruce was like, no, I was doing too much. I was trying to be this new man that Alfred wanted me to be, which stretched him thin and made it the perfect time for the Joker to attack. But before they can even finish this conversation, Selina loses consciousness and Bruce just dashes out the window, barely bandaged together, in order to get over to Selina and make sure she's alright. But it's also here where I want to get into a bit of those thoughts which Bruce had looking back on those sketches which Alfred had thought were to be a better Gotham. But it's actually here where we see that Bruce had did these sketches to draw out this city to be a nightmare that would in turn train him and make him more of a monster, so that he would then develop into who he believed he needed to be. And this is one of those things to where once again in Batman Secret Files issue 3, to where he makes it pretty clear what he means by this, because for what he needs to do, he really has two options. Because with being in a city so dark, you can either be a bright light shining out of that darkness, or you can become something so dark that the shadows themselves fear you. And though there are some figures in Gotham playing the role of that light in the dark place, but for Bruce early on his choice was the other, like go dark as possible and just scare the shadows, which I feel like is something very important when we get to the latter end of this story. But it's here where we see he's followed this older gentleman back to his house, and as it turns out, this guy's Cassandra Wyclef Baker, who is the detective who the original designer had embarrassed and caused to go into hiding. And over the years, it's almost like he had taken a similar transformation as a designer, because much like how Cassandra created the designer by embarrassing him and making him disappear for a year, to where he then re-emerged as something completely different. But now in this case, you now have Cassandra, the detective, who has learned his lesson from his loss, and now he's to the point to where he's studied so deep that he does not miss a thing. And from there, he just demonstrates his observations on Bruce, and he lets him know the cut of his jacket tells him what part of Japan he's from, the color tells him who taught him the art of the katana, the mud on his laces shows him exactly where he learned to slow down his heartbeat, the bruises on his knuckles where he learned to forge. Like, I believe this dude could literally read a whole book by the cover. But it would have been crazy if he would have said all of that and been like, I know exactly who you are, Crazy Quilt. I'm like, oh yeah, sure buddy. And about what I was saying earlier, you know what, just forget all that. But no, seriously, like this dude is legit. But you don't get that skilled at something without a little bit of insanity. And when he shows Bruce this room with notes all over the wall, including some of his own sketches, Bruce was then like, yo, you gotta teach me how to be creepy too. But no, Cassandra, he knew that Bruce wanted to learn from him how to be this amazing detective, but instead Cassandra was like, no, I'm gonna teach you how to lose. And likely because the truth is, you learn more from losing than you do winning. But jumping back to modern day Bruce, as he's on his way to go get Selina, he thinks back about his encounter with Cassander, to where he also expresses that Cassander expects Bruce to fail, much like he did, which is why he rejected Bruce, and Bruce learned from that lesson, and he told himself that he's not going to be that man who Cassander was, who the world had broken. And so now real quick, and I promise we're going to get back to it. But with that flashback, I can't help but to think, like, in that moment when Selina Kyle was telling the whole story to Bruce about the designer, which of course included the designer's origin, but I can't help but think, like, when it gets to the part where Selina tells Bruce about the designer who was made from this great detective, to where the designer got his vengeance upon and the detective was embarrassed and never was seen again, like, I can't help but think of Bruce hearing the part about the detective and being like, oh yeah, I know that little like on that one part of the story, and then being like, oh my bad, go ahead, because Bruce just ain't let it go for all these years. But either way, I just had to share that thought. But as far as Bruce, when he gets to the hospital, like when he arrives there, Selina's gone, and just for a moment it almost has that like left at the altar feeling all over again. And that feeling kind of starts to crescendo, like when the Joker, his henchmen come in and they pull up the Joker on FaceTime, and Bruce is like, where's Selina? Like, where did you take her? And the Joker's like, no, as soon as she got stitched up, she dipped out. And it immediately makes me think of when Bruce told her on the phone before he came on his way, and he told Selina, if you need to go, I understand, but I hope you don't. And for him to arrive here and she's gone, that's gotta hurt. But it's here where the Joker also shows Bruce that he has Lucius, and he kind of rubs in everything else that he got too. But he more or less tells him like, hey man, your heart broke, your leg broke, your pockets broke. But he pretty much tells Bruce from here, like, I want to go against you at your best. So get yourself together and get ready, because this war starts now. And the Joker's boys just let off fire, forcing Batman to jump out the window. But it's here where we're also filled in with a situation with Selina, because she was taken away by the Penguin, who had taken her out of the hospital after she was stitched up and brought her to the cool room where all the villains are hiding, while the Joker is loose in Gotham City with over $100 billion in every bat gadget you can imagine. And it's like all the villains was like, yeah, I'm gonna sit this one out. But in concluding, it's here where we get this moment from Bruce, and within this monologue, which is more like a prayer to Alfred, Bruce expresses that his vision and Alfred's vision, that they both go in two different directions. And when he prays to Alfred more or less to give him a sign, like to give him his approval for Bruce to go down this more or less nightmare path, lightning then strikes as if it's Alfred responding, and it's here where we see Bruce take that as confirmation that he now has Alfred's approval to fulfill his dark designs, which have grown darker and darker over the years, all built off of that nightmare that he had first seen when he was a boy. But that'll do it for this one, guys. And real quick, I want to give a shout out to all the patrons, because we got some new patrons for the month. So shout out to Alan R, Justin P, Vladimir L, Adwin D, and forgive me if I ain't say that right. Also Ken H, Eric P, Dante W, Conway B, Todd S, Ray H, and Nigel D. Thank you guys once again for supporting the channel and helping keeping the spill spilling. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.